Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Jessica Ward King, the Stigma Crusher here. Today we are finishing off our series on stigma with institutional stigma. So what is institutional stigma? It is basically just cultural stigma that has been transformed inside of our institutions. And what do I mean by institutions? Well, I mean things like our educational institutions or our healthcare institution, potentially our religious institutions, even our workplaces. And so today I want to talk about some specific examples of institutional stigma to give you some examples of what that looks like, and then finish off the series by just kind of tying it all into a neat little bow. So some examples of institutional stigma would be, for example, in the educational system. I can give you an example of when I was in academia. The In psychology and psychiatry, there is a lot of stigma against mental health. And I can say that because I lived it. When I was a psychology major and a psychology graduate student and a postgrad, I was terrified lest anyone should find out that I was struggling with mental illness because of the stigma specifically in that field. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that stigma. One of them is that when you're studying that field, either to research it or to practice it, there's a certain amount of kind of compartmentalizing that you do. There's like an us versus them. So there's an we who are studying it versus they who we are studying. And there's that compartmentalizing that you do because you have to, because you are studying humans, you kind of compartmentalize yourself off from the humans that you are studying. And so I think to a certain extent, you kind of cut yourself off from the people with mental illness that you are studying or that you are treating. And that tends to cut you off from allowing yourself to be one of those people with mental illness that you are studying or treating. And therefore, there tends to be, and I'm not saying this as a blanket statement for all people that are studying or practicing psychology or psychiatry, because that's certainly not the case. But there's a tendency within the field for there to be this feeling that those who are practicing or treating or studying, the field can't have or shouldn't have or mustn't have the illnesses that they are treating or studying. And so that lent me to feel as though if anyone found out that I was actually suffering with an illness that we were studying, my career as it was beginning would be over. And now that may have been erroneous, that may have been wrong, but that was the feeling that I got as someone studying the field. And again, it's been quite a few years since I was a student, and so it may have changed since then. Though I have heard that it is not, but it may have. Still, I know that the field does tend to have a great deal of stigma around it. There's another reason that I think there may be that stigma, and that's the reason is that when you're studying that field, there tends to be a lot of studying case studies of the most extreme cases. There tends to be, especially in academic settings, seeing patients of the most extreme form of whatever disease or disorder you're studying. And so there tends to be this big chasm between typical life as you know it and the life of someone living with that illness. And there tends to be, it seems like there's nothing in between. There isn't like a gradation of typical life and then illness and then extreme illness. It's just either all or nothing. You either have no illness or you have a very extreme illness. And so in order to say like I'm struggling with depression or I'm struggling with anxiety, it seems like you have to say I'm struggling with extreme depression or I'm struggling with extreme anxiety or nothing. And so it seems to be this great big jump for someone that is studying the field to make, to say that they're struggling with a mental illness, because all they ever see of mental illness is someone struggling with an extreme form of that mental illness. And so I think that there seems to be this extreme jump for them to make. And that might be another reason for the stigma that there is around mental illness in that field. And so these are just my thoughts. This is not backed up by science or anything. These are just my thoughts after years of thinking on the subject as to why there might be this stigma that I found in the field. But those are some things that I did find in the field, and in the academic institution that I was working and living in. And so that's one example of institutional stigma that I lived in. Another example of institutional stigma is in the workplace. So in the workplace, you'll often see the sentiments that someone with mental illness is potentially at any time going to go off on long-term disability or even short-term disability, but that they're potentially at any time going to leave a project high and dry, that you can't trust them with the good projects, that you can't give them the heavy files, that you don't want to stress them out, for one thing. That people with mental illness can't be trusted with, the extreme work, that you don't want to, that you want to treat them with kid gloves, right? And so there's a lot of institutional stigma in the workplace around mental illness. And there's been a lot of work in the last 10 or 15 years around trying to improve mental health in the workplace, but not a lot of work trying to improve the state of mental illness in the workplace. In fact, not a lot of work and not a lot of talk at all about mental illness in the workplace. It's getting better. There is some talk about mental illness in the workplace now, but a lot of talk has happened about mental health, just not a lot of talk about mental illness. The talk that does happen about mental illness tends to be about disability and disability benefits, and what to do about return to work, and how to return someone to work gradually so as not to stress them out, and so as not to get them back on to disability, and so on, and basically how to treat them with kid gloves so that they don't crack again. And so that's the institutional stigma that you'll see at work in a lot of workplaces. Other places where you'll see institutional stigma, you might see it in religious institutions. So a lot of religious institutions will have stigma around mental illness, potentially around how it's seen in terms of whether it's seen in a good light or a bad light in terms of deities, for example, or whether it's seen to be something that's of the devil, for example, or of demon worship. And how it's treated in terms of whether it's seen to be something that can be treated by the clergy of that religion, or whether it's seen to be something that should be treated by science, for example. And so there can be a lot of institutional stigma around mental illness in religion. There's a lot of stigma around mental illness in our sports institutions. And so you'll often see that when a sports personality comes out with their story of living with mental illness, it becomes front page news. And that's because there's a lot of this idea that there should not be any weakness in sport. And for absolute sure, mental illness is seen as a sign of weakness, particularly in sport. In other ways as well, but particularly in sport, I would say. And so when someone does come out with their story of living with mental illness, it becomes front page news. It becomes a story of, of courage and of coming out with well, definitely of fortitude and definitely of something that should be looked up to and whatnot, which is all well and good, but that person becomes a poster boy or woman for mental illness in sport, and that can become very patronizing for that individual. So there can be a lot of again, institutional stigma in sport. Even in Hollywood, you'll see, or just in our in I suppose Hollywood. I was going to say Hollywood or our music industry. That's what I'm trying to think of. The music industry. I remember very vividly when Selena Gomez came out with her story of being diagnosed as bipolar. I remember it because it was it was meaningful to me as a young woman myself being diagnosed with bipolar, that I thought, oh, Selena Gomez is diagnosed with bipolar. That, that's not so bad. Someone that's famous and beautiful and talented and multi, makes makeup and make music and is an actress and all these things, and is also has bipolar disorder. That's not such a bad association to have. I remember that vividly. But it was like front page news, and she made a documentary about it, and it continues to be news. And that's because, it has the potential to ruin her career, and yet instead she's making it a career making move. But it has the potential to ruin her career because people might not want to work with her, because she could be potentially, as we talked about last week, potentially violent, but also potentially she could walk off of projects. She could be unstable and unwilling to finish projects. She could, she could be a lot of things because of this mental illness, and that could potentially ruin her career. And so there, that, relating to workplace stigma, relating to, but it's all kind of wrapped into this Hollywood stigma around the starlet that either that because of her mental illness fades away, or in this case the starlet that becomes more of a star because of her mental illness. And so there's that institutional stigma there within Hollywood itself, as a workplace, but also as an institution in its own right. And so pretty much any grand institution that you can think of, the healthcare institution, we know that medical practitioners, there's a lot of stigma around mental illness. A lot of times when I'll present to the emergency room, I get a lot of flack from emergency room doctors and nurses just because of my diagnosis. Just because when they see that I'm the medications that I'm on, and they see that I have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, I will get flack for being potentially a drug seeker, or, my wife will often just come with me to the emergency room because she has to advocate for me to get proper treatment, because I'll get dismissed just because of my history of bipolar disorder. So I know that there's a lot of stigma amongst the medical community, and I know I'm not the only one with those kinds of stories. So please comment down below if you have similar stories to mine. But so we know that in the healthcare institution, there's a lot of institutional stigma. Pretty much any institution that you can think of, you're going to find institutional stigma against mental illness. And that's because institutional stigma is essentially, as I mentioned, cultural stigma that has just kind of transformed itself within the institution that you'll find it in. And it's interesting because I mentioned that self-stigma was just like cultural stigma that has transformed itself within the self. So really, cultural stigma is like the central node of stigma. It's the quintessential stigma, and it just kind of farms itself out to become self-stigma or institutional stigma, whatever kind of specialized kind of stigma you want to find. But really, stigma itself can be found everywhere. And that's because it's shame. It's that mark of shame or hate that you can find within our institutions, within our own selves, within our own culture against mental illness. And it is insidious. It is pervasive. And that's why it's so important to crush. It's important to crush it wherever you see it. And by coming out with stories of our own mental health and mental illness, like these stars, like these sports personalities, like our own selves within academia, like our own selves within our own lives, coming out with our own stories is possibly the best way of fighting and crushing stigma wherever we see it. Because one at a time, if we can share our own stories of mental illness, we can help to crush that stigma in our culture and in our institutions and in our own selves by sharing our stories and by letting other people know that we are not ashamed. We are not afraid. We do not hate. We don't hate ourselves. We don't hate each other. That's the best way I have found to crush stigma. And that's why I do what I do. That's why I share my story on this platform and in other ways. So that's what I wanted to really share with this series, is how to crush the stigma and why we crush the stigma. So next week, we're going to get back to talking a little bit about my own experience of mental illness and mental health. And so I hope you'll stick around for that. But in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.
Stigma Crusher.